So Soundarya is going to be our presenter du jour. So let's start by doing our first chant. Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om. So this chant we do in the beginning of any journey or anything new that we're doing, so that we get the maximum benefits of the work that we're undertaking. The implications of this verse is that we want to go essentially from darkness to light, which is the final goal and place where we know our true nature. Cool. So welcome back, everybody. We are sort of in our middle of our 12-week course. So this is the 7th class. And we're making our journey quite well. And I think the last place that we left off was we spoke about the importance of working, the fact that even people of knowledge and people of wisdom continue to work even after liberation. And people who strive. So I think we were on verse 15. If we finished verse 15, so just to review what verse 15 was, the seekers who are people who are after freedom, they also work. And there's a common misunderstanding that if you're seeking liberation, you have to renounce this world and become like a renunciate and give up on like life and worldly things. And that's not true. So, there's ways to do action in this world and be in this world and yet be striving for liberation as well. So we're going to learn how to essentially act in a way that will lead to liberation. And we've sort of, we've covered a few points and tools that help us act in a way that, single pointed attention, for example, is a way that we act where we are not building on new things and thinking about stuff that we did in the past or things that we want in the future, which kind of distract us and dissipate our energies. So we want to sort of just be in the now and focus on stuff that's in front of me, so I can do the work efficiently and not keep thinking about stuff which is not important. So that's like one aspect and one tool that we learned. And now I think we're going to go down a little bit more technical aspect of like what is action, what is inaction, and the distinction between the two. And finally, we want to get to a place where we are doing actionless action, which is a new concept that we're going to learn. Cool. So any thoughts or questions from what we've covered so far? Anything that came up last week? If not, we can get into the scripture. Cool. Would anyone want to chant either the Sanskrit or do the English? Silence. Okay, I can do the Sanskrit. Harsha, did you say you want to do the English?
Yeah, I don't mind doing the English.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Oh, sorry, Becca did. Okay, Becca, you can do it next week. I'll remember that.
Sounds good.
Cool. So we are on verse 16. So sound is going to present. So if you don't mind presenting, sound. I think maybe you are already. Okay.
I am presenting.
Okay. Cool. So let me move the screen over because I have an external monitor. I can't see it here. All right. Kim karma kima karmeti kavyo patra mohitaha tate karma pravakshyami yajvatyatva moksha se shubhat.
What is action? What is inaction? As to this, even the wise are deluded. Therefore, I shall teach you action, the nature of action and inaction, knowing which you shall be liberated from the evil of samsara, the wheel of birth and death.
Cool. So here, this is what I was talking about, where, we have this ideas of doing stuff in this world, and then people who don't tend to act, we call them lazy, and we say that they're not doing any actions and they are a burden to society. We have all these ideas and that we are all presented, where we have to act in this world, we have to be useful to society, and we consider that as like action, right? And inaction is usually, our understanding is like not doing anything, just like sitting in bed maybe, or just like uh, sitting in your chair and watching TV or something. Like that's kind of considered inaction. But there's like more subtler implications of what it really is. And in here, because it isn't very easy to understand without somebody who's smarter than us telling us, we don't really think about it too much of like, what kinds of actions I'm doing and how does that really impact me and my mind and all of that. So here, he's saying that it's confusing. So even the wise are deluded. So people who are actually pretty smart, even they are deluded. So, what do the lay people even do? So here he's saying that I will teach you what the nature of action and inaction is. Because if we understand the nature of something, then we can work with it, and it won't sort of bind us so much. And here, once we understand the nature, we will be liberated from the wheel of birth and death, which is we will go beyond the physical, because what we have said so far is that only the physical, which is the physical body or our minds, only they have the concept of like birth and death. There's something beyond that, which we haven't had a taste of, but it's a hypothesis that there is something beyond that, and we can sort of transcend the physical nature of our bodies and minds. So once we understand what the nature of action is, we shall be able to transcend it. So going on, does anyone have questions about this? Okay. Karmano hyapi bodhavyam च vikarmanah akarmanascha bodhavyam gahana karmano gatihi.
For verily, the true nature of right action should be known. Only that of forbidden or unlawful action and of inaction, imponderable is the nature, path of action.
All right. So here, we are given that there's like right action, and then there's like, forbidden, or like, I usually like to translate it as actions that bind us, or actions that are against us in ways. Says, the technical term here, I guess they haven't used it, but usually in this work, there's the Sanskrit there's two words that we get shreyas and we get prayas, which is, so shreyas is essentially actions that are good for us, things where we are, freeing our minds a little bit. So like, getting good at some passion that we like, you know, serving society, or things that, we are not building our limited sense of ego. Those are usually tend to be good actions that are useful. And then the other side is like actions which are like more addictive, where we are just thinking of our own selfish gains, own selfish pleasures. And those things are not from a moral standpoint, whether it's good or bad, but just the effect of those actions lead us to a place where we have more desires, right? So like, if you're only thinking about our own self, if you're only thinking about how, if I do this, what will I gain from it? What's in it for me? If you're always looking at the world from that viewpoint, the result of of thinking from that viewpoint is going to be, we are going to have more and more desires, and we're going to have more and more fears, all of that, because we are not seeing that this illusion that, you know, I have to protect myself. Like, that's essentially an illusion where I feel that I need to do actions to protect my limited ego and identity, and that's an illusion. And we spend lifetimes essentially trying to protect this ego, only to realize that it didn't exist in the first place, and it only existed in my own mind, and I gave it all the importance, and because of that importance it became more and more concrete. So it's sort of this vicious cycle. So unless we kind of understand that that's what is going on, it's very hard to break out of it. So so in this verse we are talking about the same stuff, which is, you know, there are some actions which are good for us, and there are some actions which are not very good for us. But because we don't understand what is the impact of our actions, we never get out of it. And here he's saying, you know, it's so hard, it's imponderable. Essentially, we can't, because once we are involved in certain actions, we're just so wrapped up that it's very hard to get out of it. So now, you know, during the times of COVID, where we all have some time, you know, instead of being consistently engaged in the stuff that's going on, which is, you know, the world is always going to have problems, it's always going to be changing, but we get so wrapped up in the world, we never get a chance to step back and say, what is it really? Like, how do I sort of get out of this wheel of you know, birth and death, essentially? And we're going to learn how to do that. Any thoughts about this? All right. Karmayan ya karmayaha pashyet karmani cha karmayaha sabuddhimanam punyeshu sayukta kritsa karma kret.
He who recognizes inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men. He is a yogi and a true performer of all actions.
All right, so here we're talking about a person who has now sort of reached a place where they can recognize, when I am doing certain actions, there is a sense of inactivity in it. So for example, you know, I can say, you know, I'm going to give up on all of my duties that I have, and I'm just going to go and sit in a cave. Like, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to, like, you know, give up all of the relationships in my life, and I'm going to go, you know, on this journey, and I'm going to just sit in the cave. But if we're sitting in the cave and still thinking about, you know, the relationships that I have, the jobs that I wanted, all of the desires, that's essentially not useful, because even though my physical body is inactive, right, like I'm not really doing stuff physically, but my mental mind is still active. So, you know, from the outside, someone may look at this person and say, oh, wow, this person has given up life and, you know, wonderful or whatever, right? But if our internal experience is that we are still thinking about the world, that is like essentially, you know, living in a hypocrisy, right? It's a hypocritical life, which is, we are not really renounced the world. We may have physically given up things, but mentally we have not renounced anything. Our entire mental energy is being spent on thinking about stuff. So we have to be very clear and honest with our own selves to see, what is it that my mind is focusing on moment to moment. Am I thinking about all of the, you know, relationships that I want? Am I thinking about the money that I don't have? All of that. So, right. So recognizing that even though we may think that I'm not really working or doing any actions right now, the mind is still active. So recognizing that there's activity happening, even though there seems to be inactivity, or there's this idea that I'm not doing anything physically. And the same way, which is, you know, somebody who is, you know, maybe a scientist or a poet, they may be physically still. And so from the outside, someone may say, this person never does anything in life, but internally they're working, right? Like they're thinking about the plays that they want to write, they're thinking about the poetry or whatever activity that you're doing, that's happening. But to a person who's outside looking at this person, they may not know what's going on. Same thing with a yogi as well. A yogi may look like they're not doing anything. They're just sitting on the street, or like, they never really do anything in life. But what they're doing internally, nobody really knows. But the yogi is always sort of, doing practices, trying to discriminate, trying to have single pointed attention. And all of those things take effort. Uh, and, once we start to recognize that what is going on, then, that person is considered wise. And that person becomes a yogi, because the whole idea of a yogi, so yogi is a good, interesting word. Yogi is essentially a person who does yoga, or who practices yoga rather. And yoga, as we all learned, is, uniting the mind with the infinite. There is a union happening. And so yogi is essentially striving to practice, the tools and all of the stuff that he or she may have learned to unite the mind with the infinite. And that is also actions that is happening constantly in the yogi's experience. And once we get a taste of what does it mean to act, like, if we are acting from a place with single pointed attention, that's considered good. If we are acting from a place where our mind is completely scattered, where we have 10 different things that we're thinking about, even though in our minds we may think, oh wow, I'm so busy, I have all these things going on, but really we're not doing anything, because all we're doing is thinking and wasting energy and dissipating stuff. So we want to get good at acting in a way that serves us and serves all of the desires that we really have, so that way we can get it done and then move on so that we can move to something higher than just these physical desires that we have and experiences that we really crave. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah. Is this to say that effort is action, even if the effort is not in the physical?
So give me an example of effort.
You were mentioning what a scientist who sits there and thinks about a lot of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's putting an effort, or they're putting an effort in their mind, yet
Mm-hmm.
it may not look like it in the physical or the outside.
Right. Yeah. So I think in the end, what we're going to learn is that if we are doing any action where we are lost in the activity, doesn't matter what the action is, but because we're doing it, we are lost, that is considered, I would say, beneficial action, because we are not thinking about the other stuff. So the core, the crux of our problem is that our mind is too scattered and is mostly living in imagination. But when we do action, our body and the mind immediately comes to the now, if we are truly paying attention to the action. And what I mean by that is, like, our mind stops reflecting on stuff that happened in the past. It stops thinking about some planning in the future, because while we're doing actions, it's just about what is happening right now, right? Like, so for example, if you're swimming, you stop when you're swimming, you're only focusing on the swimming. Or maybe you're trying to learn how to swim, you're only focused on the learning aspect, right? You're not thinking about what you're going to eat for lunch. You're not, if you're truly, like, trying to learn how to swim, you're not going to think about all of those things, and you're not thinking about, like, how you made a mistake at work or something that happened in the past. So I would say action, like, beneficial action is when we are acting from a place where we are in the now. And that can happen when we are, in single pointed attention, or there's some other practices too, but essentially, if we are in the now and our entire presence and awareness is in the now, then that's good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. But we must start to recognize that in our own life. So, this is also a practice where we want to start to get conscious of when I am trying to do something, is my mind scattered or not? If it is scattered, I'm essentially in inaction, because I'm not doing what is in front of me. I'm thinking about other things, right? So we want to start to pay attention to that. And it's okay. So, first step is recognizing where we're at. So, if our mind has been sort of trained in a way where we are constantly scattered, it's fine. That's like, the past is sort of the past actions that we have done of like continuing to give scattered mind energy. The consequence of that is like, today I have a scattered mind, but just the act of recognizing that will give us a doorway or an opening where we can sort of start to move in a different direction, which is when you notice the scattered mind, bring it back to the present. When you notice the scattered mind, bring it back to the present. And over time, this practice and this effort that we put in is going to then change the mind in the future. And the future mind would be less scattered, and eventually we can get out of it. So that's the practice. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, let's do the next one. Yasya sarve samarambhaha kamasankalpa varjitaha jnanagni dagakarmanam tamahu panditam buddhaha.
Whose undertakings are all devoid of desires and purposes, and whose actions have been burnt by the fire of knowledge, him the wise call a sage.
Cool. So in the previous verse, I think, can we just quickly go back to the previous verse? So here, the person who recognizes this hasn't reached perfection yet. So, perfection here is like, the state of self-realization. We are still talking about a person who is, striving, who's a yogi. So a yogi is a person who practices yoga, but a person who has reached the final goal is no longer a yogi because they don't need to practice anymore. So the next verse we are talking about, so let's go back to the verse 19. So in this verse, we're essentially talking about a person who has reached the final goal. So, a sage, Buddha. So that, that's the word that they used. So once we all have the Buddha nature in us. All we have to do is recognize it. And once we recognize it, we become that. And here that we're talking about like, how does a Buddha act? So Buddha once we reach that final destination, all of our desires and like reason, like, need for having a purpose, all of those things have been burned away, because all those things have the motivation for all of those things are like, I will be happy when, or I will be happy because. There's always this sort of what's the word, like there's a condition with those desires, and that's a false condition, because the person of knowledge knows for a fact that when any desire is satisfied, they only experience a taste of their own self nature. So it doesn't matter what they do, they are always in that state, and they have access to that state that everyone is craving, which is, I want to be free, I want to be blissful, I want to have, and I just want to be okay with my own self, right? Like in the end, we all essentially experience the world through our own senses. And if our own senses report terrible things, we're going to feel terrible. If our own senses report pleasurable things, we're going to feel great. So the sage, or the person of knowledge, or Buddha, has burnt up this entire sort of mental structure, and it's gone. So no sort of thought that sort of comes up where we consider it to be a terrible thought, or one thought that comes up where we consider it to be like a thought that we want to get away from, all of those things are gone. And because they're gone, there's nothing that needs to be done. So in terms of like, and insistently, so like nothing needs to be done in the sense of like, they don't need to do anything to kind of strive anymore. The sense of striving has gone. And then what they will do is they will act out of a sense of compassion and sense of what is needed in society. We haven't talked about that here, but that's essentially the consequence. And the way that we reach there is because they have burnt up all of their actions by the fire of knowledge. Because once we have this direct experience that I am the self, that I am not my mind, I am not my body, and not from like an intellectual understanding, initially we get those ideas, and that's when we're at the state of being a yogi, where I have these new ideas, I want to work with them, and I want to use them to kind of free myself. But by doing that, what we're doing is we are churning and we are lighting a fire within us. We're lighting a fire where all of our misunderstandings, all of our false ideas, all of our egoistic impressions that we have gathered, all of them start to burn. And eventually everything is burnt away. And what is left is just our pure being. And that's just always with us, because once we see it, we just cannot lose it again. So that's kind of the question we're answering, is like, how does the sage, what does the sage do? And this is what the sage does. Acts without any desires or purposes. Any thoughts or questions about this? Okay, let's do the next one. Yaktva karma phalangasang nitya tripto nirashrayah karmarya bhripravrattopi naiva kischit karoti saha.
Having abandoned attachment to the fruits of action, ever content, depending on nothing, he does not do anything, though engaged in actions.
Awesome. So here we're talking again, like what does the Buddha do, and how do they act? Like, because they have realized that the fruits there is no such thing as a fruit, right? The fruit is an idea that we have, that when some action is completed, I will feel blissful. That is like an imagination. And we are constantly living in that imagination. But to the sage, or to the person of knowledge, that idea is gone, because they don't care about the fruits anymore, because the fruit is right here all the time. We have eating the fruit all the time. And because the fruit is available, they have abandoned it. And then because they have the fruit, they're ever content. So in the sense of like, they have nothing to gain from anything. So, there's a sense of like mistrust when you meet some people. You're like, oh, I wonder what their motivation is. Like, why are they doing this? We're always imagining and trying to like figure out what somebody wants. But for a sage, there is no motivation. They're just doing it because that is what is in their life. That is what needs to be done from their perspective. And that's the skills that they potentially may have. And they just want to express themselves. So action is done from a sense of expression. And they depend on nothing, because, in the end, we are all seeking this sense of importance, or like whatever it is in life, like value, like feeling appreciated in society, having a good set of community. All of those things have this root in them, which is, when I get them, I will feel happier than I feel in this present moment. But for a sage, that has been burnt up. So he does not do anything is, if you take it, all of these things very literally, then, you may get a sense of like, oh, this person is just lazy, right? They don't act. And that is, going back to the previous verse, which is a lay person may look at a person and say, oh, this person doesn't act, right? Like, so if I look at a scientist sitting in their lab, as a laborer who like goes and like works in the fields and slaves away every day, I may look at a person who, who is a scientist and be like, this person doesn't do shit, right? It's like, I am slaving away and like, what a lazy person. But the scientist knows that they are actually solving problems and using their mind and using a higher level of intelligence, not just like their physical, using their mind. And they've developed it using, practice, going to school, all of that. So similarly to a lay person looking at a sage, they may just be sitting and doing nothing. But inside, it's the sense of struggle and all of that is gone. Um, and they may do something or they may not. So like if you look at historically, there's been a lot of sages and saints who have done a lot of work, and they do it because that's society calls them and asks them to do it, and they do it out of a sense of compassion. So even though they're engaged in action, so like if you look at Buddha, for example, he traveled the entire country of India, taught, opened all these schools, and essentially converted the entire country from one religion to another because he could do it, and he was engaged in action all the time. But from his perspective, he did not do any action because action, we want to define. So now there's a new definition of action. So our old definition was action was like, if I do anything, that's considered action. If I sit still, that's considered an action. But now we are given a new definition of action, which is any action that results in my ego being more contracted, that's considered action. Any action that is that frees my ego, or in the sense that it's not even so much about freeing the ego. I stop thinking about myself. Right? Like, so a good example is if I'm serving serving society, if I'm volunteering in a place where I'm not thinking about my own self, my attention is now on somebody else. My attention is on something outside of my limited ego. Naturally, uh, naturally, I'm not thinking of my limited self and will I be okay and all of that, because my focus is on something else. So in those cases, we are essentially doing action, but from a slightly different standpoint. And this word we're going to use is called actionless action. So in those cases, we're doing actionless action. Because even though we may look like we're engaged, but from a karmic standpoint, so karma is the word we use to give action, but from a karmic standpoint is like, from an action standpoint, we're not building up more and more impressions and karma for our own self. But if you do things from an egoistic standpoint, where you're constantly thinking about, if I do this, will I be okay? If I start this project, how is it going to benefit me or my family? All of those egoistic ideas that we have, if you're doing actions from that standpoint, we are essentially building our store of karma constantly. So we need to start acting from a place where we stop thinking about our own limited nature, which is why things like selfless service, doing, volunteering, like single point attention, we're not, in those moments, we're not thinking about our own self. So we want to start acting from that place where we stop thinking about ourselves. A lot of people come into this work for self-improvement, right? We're like, I want to improve myself. I want growth. I want all of that, which is great because, we want to have a good personality, a strong personality where we feel confident that we are capable human beings. But there comes a time when we want to start moving towards self-abandonment. Notice that slightly change of language. So we will go from self-improvement to self-abandonment, which is, I want to abandon myself, and myself here being my limited, identity. Start to abandon it. And what starts to remain is the ground of being, which is, who we really are. And that we start acting from that place. And in that place, we have whatever we are seeking. So once we have what we are seeking, all actions from that place come from a sense of, contentment, from a sense of expression, from a sense of love. Like when you are with people that you love, when you do work for them, it doesn't feel like work, right? Like if you've ever, made food for your loved one, or like, you've hung out with your friends that you really love and you've done work for them, in those moments, it never feels like you're doing any work. And why is that? Because we're not thinking of our limited self. We're not thinking of, will I be okay if I do this action? So can we start to act from that place in this all the time? Not just when we are with our loved ones, right? So think about, like, if our identity is very limited, if we only consider, like, let's say my close family as me, then only when I'm with them will my sense of ego disappear. Because when I'm with them, I won't be thinking about, if I do this, will I be okay? If I do that, will I not be okay? Right? When I'm with them, I'll be like, okay, this is fine. But the moment I step out of that circle, of that bubble, now my entire viewpoint and worldview is going to be like, what about me? What about me? How is this going to affect my family? Right? So we need to start to expand that bubble a little bit, because the moment we start to expand our bubble, we can start to live from that place more and more, more and more. And we want to start to make it so big that there's no place where we are not acting from that place. And essentially that can only happen when we give up our sense of identity and we give up our limited ego. And the consequence of that is that we will come to this experience where we are ever content, we are not dependent on anything, and we will continue to act. It's almost like we are acting for our family all the time. There's no distinction, because we have stopped like that thought never arises. So all of this is like the consequence, but it's good to know that this is what we want to do, and this is where we want to get to. Any thoughts about what I've said so far?
I have a question and a thought, Puneet, more around, I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm struggling with understanding how to get there, in the sense that today I still have to do a lot of things that, I mean, like generically, we all have to do things that may not fall under the description of what you just said, right? Like we may have to go to work, we may have to work with difficult people that we may not, that may not be pleasant, or we may have to do things for ourselves. So how should we think about the journey to get to that point?
Okay, that's a great question. So do you have a person or in your life where if they were in front of you, you would act your best, you would behave in the best way, or you would be the most delicate, or like like the most I would say where our entire attention would be on the person? Is there such a person in your life? Or
Yeah, I would say so.
So now the practice would be, think that that person is there all the time in every action that you do. So in places where when you think that, oh, this other person that I'm doing something for is just is a terrible person, all of that starts to dissolve because our attention is now on something else. It's on the fact that there's this other entity around me, and all of my desire is to kind of live up to this standard or live up to this ideal. So like we want to raise our ideals to something even higher, right? Like, which is, can I act from that place all the time? And keep reminding ourselves that that's how I want to act. And what's going to happen is, all these people who we think bother us, who are in our lives, and we spend a lot of energy like trying to like not really do the action, but just reflect on why is this happening. And you know how we kind of like tend to just ruminate over things and not really like solving what needs to be done, but like just
Yeah.
So we need to stop doing that first, because that is not useful at all. So a good practice is to start to look at people from that ideal, which is like, if you have a person in your life where, if they were in front of you, you would be in your best behavior, and not from like a disciplinary standpoint, but because of the love of that relationship. If you can imagine that person is around me all the time, then I will strive my best to be act from that place. So that's one way that you can start to break these like deep impressions that we have, which is this person or this thing, because all of that may appear that it's external, but actually all of it is internal. It just manifesting as a person, or it's manifesting as a situation, but cause of it, the core of it is within us. So we have to start to deal with that first. So, if let's say an uncomfortable feeling is coming up when a person, so essentially, even if you look at a person who's saying something mean or like being difficult, that discomfort is first appears within our own bosom, right? Within our own experience. And then we say, oh, it's because of this person. But before we start to project and say it's this person who's doing it, start to notice that it's actually appearing here. So there's something within us that is actually uncomfortable. So if we can start to deal with it right there, holding it in place, thinking about the tools that we learned in the previous chapter, which is all of the things in the past have caused me to feel this way right now. I cannot change how I'm feeling right now because, it's happening, but I can not choose to continue to propagate it. So that's the self-effort that needs to be done moment to moment. And then how do I not focus on this thing? And it's not by suppressing. So not by saying, no, I'm not going to feel this way, because that is not acknowledging what is going on. So instead we say, okay, stuff is coming up. I'm feeling discomfort. This person, even though they're being, they're wrong, they're, whatever the situation is, we still focus on something else. We put our attention to something else, which is maybe in this situation, you may need to solve some problem, but focus our attention there. Like try to be solution oriented rather than continuing to give energy to this person or this feeling or this emotion or whatever it is. We want to start to step away from it. We want to not give in more energy, because this emotion is there because we have given it energy. It has not appeared magically because of somebody else. We are fully responsible for every emotion that we feel. So take joy, and when we are happy, be responsible for the fact that the emotion of joy that you're feeling is because of you. And the same thing, if the emotion of misery that you're feeling is also because of you. We cannot, be half-assed about one thing. It's like the same side, two sides of the coin, right? If you feel that you're responsible for all the happiness in your life, you're also responsible for all the miseries in your life. You cannot have one or the other. If you accept one, you have to accept both. Yeah. So once we start to take responsibility, that gives us some space to play with it, because it didn't come out of outside. It only came from within. So start to change the way we perceive, the way we look at situations, and start to focus on something else. Like my teacher says, one practice that we can say is that you have a new employer in your life. Whoever you work for, whoever you're married to, whoever your relationships are, all of those people are gone. New person is Krishna. Krishna is the employer. Krishna is your husband. Krishna is your family. All of that, because that if you don't have an ideal, or what I said in the beginning, which is if you don't have a person, you can say Krishna is that person. And if that person, so you look at everything with that viewpoint that they are this divine being. And when our attitude changes, then we can sort of, move in a different direction very easily, because the sense of reverence, the sense of holiness, or whatever that feeling is, we will act from that place rather from this limited sense of what am I going to get from the situation?
Got it. Thank you.
And it's very hard. Not to say that this is easy, but it can be done, and it takes practice, and it takes consistent effort. It's not we do this class weekly, but this is a daily thing. This is not something that we can build, once a week, right? We have to make a commitment that I'm sick and tired of being, sick and tired. Like if we are in that place where we have gone through the same stuff over and over and over and over again, we have to start to take a commitment to say, okay, I'm not going to act from the same place again. If we look at people who do the same things and expect a different outcome, we'll be like, oh, wow, that's crazy. A person is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different outcome.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very easy to look at somebody else and say, wow, that's crazy. So we need to look at our own self from the same eyes of like, a little bit of like detachment and see, okay, this is what I'm doing. These are the sort of traits that I have. These are the behaviors that I have. Once we recognize those things, we can then start to make those changes. So much of this work is just becoming conscious of our habitual tendencies and all of those things that we have, and looking at it from a sense of like, compassion too, because, we have not being too hard on ourselves where, if we fail and we do the same thing again, it's like we said, how could we do this? We are so stupid. All of those things which are essentially causing self-harm and deepening those roots in many ways. We want to stop all of that. We want to stop being violent to our own selves first, completely accept that whatever has happened in the past has happened. I cannot change any of it. And whatever's coming up, that I can, at least process that in a slightly different way, which will lead me to a different place. And that's the effort that we're putting in. But keep at it. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Puneet, the last point you made makes a lot of sense to me. It almost sounds similar to treat others as you would like to be treated, or to frame it in what you said is treat others as you would treat your closest family. So that makes sense to me. But going back to the other point, and maybe a little bit more to the verse of if we're in service of our family, then that is a little bit in line with enlightenment, and kind of forgetting ourselves. But this is hard for me to understand because of the example in my life, and that is I'm the oldest of 5, and I raised all my siblings. And the first 28 years of my life, I lived in service of my family. And at that time, it provided them an excuse to continue. It enabled them. And I didn't have a self-practice or a self-care practice whatsoever. And so it seemed unhealthy in the eyes of, the way the world sees things. And I've since moved away from that because it also didn't provide space for me to get to know my true nature and be more in the service of the community versus just continuing to serve my family. So do you have any thoughts on that?
So family was just one example. Like it doesn't, if there are some elements in your family which are not serving you, that's totally fine to get away from, right? It's not hard and fast that, you have to be with your family and like, that's the cards you've been dealt with. So like, that's it. We can make changes to our lives. It's more about like, are we making those changes from a sense of running away from it, like from a sense of aversion, or are we doing it from a place of neutrality? We don't have to love our family. If let's say you have a very toxic relationship in your family and you need to cut it, are we cutting it from a place of neutrality, or are we cutting it from a place of like flight or fight response? And that's something to notice. It's always about like how we're doing the action and not so much about the action.
So what does that look like, the difference between neutrality and fight or flight?
It looks like understanding why the other person is behaving in that way, getting familiar with that, and not from, and just empathizing that, okay, this person is acting crazy, but they're crazy because of something within their own, like, there's some discomfort that they are feeling that's leading them to have those outbursts or however they're responding. So like having that compassion that, okay, that person is also suffering, like nobody loves to act crazy, right? It's always that we are blind, or rather we don't have tools to process stuff in our own self, be it discomfort, be it, too much emotion, too much energy, anger. All of those things are just essentially energy in our body. It manifests as anger, manifests as sadness, manifests as joy. And if you don't have the tools to process it, you consider a person to be crazy on the street. Somebody who can slightly manage it is considered socially okay, right? But like somebody who just like screams on the street because they don't have that sort of filter, or like they don't have that slight skill of being able to manage it, is considered a crazy person. So in reality, most of us are crazy. It's just that we are socially acceptable, right? Some of us are not socially acceptable and we are considered like insane. So there's a very thin line between sanity and insanity, actually. So start to kind of understand. So, this work, they say that this work makes you, since you understand your own self very well, or your own emotional structure, your own mental structure, all of those things you're basically understanding. Because of that understanding, you can understand everybody else, right? Because everybody is the same and everybody acts out of the same motivations. Nobody has like different motivations and different emotion. Like everyone has an emotional nature, everyone has a mental nature, everyone has a physical nature, and we have that too. So because we understand our own nature, we can say, okay, that's the other person is probably acting in the same, has the same motivations. Once we get that, then we can look at any person and say, okay, they're acting crazy, but this is probably the reason why they're acting crazy. And then we can look at our own lives and say, I have also potentially acted crazy in the past, maybe not as crazy as this person, but when I was acting crazy, I was feeling angry, I was feeling fear, I was feeling frustrated. I had those emotions. So this person probably has those same emotions. And now I'm in a place where I've dealt with them and this person is not there. That's the only difference, right? Mm-hmm. So if we can come to that place, which of neutrality, you don't have to love that person. They're still a crazy person, like at least they're crazy to you. You don't have to love them, but you have at least come to this understanding, and this real understanding, not this, intellectual thing, but this real direct understanding. Once we're there, now you can choose to do what you want. If you want to cut them from your life, that's fine, but you're cutting them from a place of neutrality. If you want to like continue to have them in your life, that's fine too. But know that action the action doesn't really bind us. It's like how we do the action is what binds us. So if let's say we cut away this relationship with a sense of aversion, saying, I cannot deal with this person, this is horrible. What's going to happen is that some other relationship in your life is going to have the same nature. There will be one completely different person, but has the same relationship with this person that you're trying to run away from. And this other person has appeared in your life. And that's the karma, that the karma of this world, which is if we don't deal with the karmic, the karma of our own lives, it will manifest and give us situations where we will have to deal with it. So because we didn't deal with it with this previous person, now a new person has appeared, where we have to go through the same process. And once we reach a new place of neutrality, we have dissolved that karma. And that's never going to tarnish us again. Because if the same similar person comes up in the future, we will have the same outlook of like, oh, wow, this person is suffering and they're acting out of their suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like family is just a placeholder for people on the earth, right? So as long as you're in service or moving towards service of others, whether it is family or others outside of that is what we're shooting for and will help lead to enlightenment.
Correct. And family is very interesting because we spend so much time with them. So we absorb a lot of like the craziness which every family has. And I'm laughing because the Sanskrit word for family is bandha, which is also a word we use for bondage. So essentially, family is bondage, and that's like universally true across all cultures, right? It's not just a. So I find that pretty funny. But yes, like family, it's like it's your viewpoint, right? Like you can consider any person as your family. It's just like how you view them.
Yeah.
So
Thank you, Puneet.
yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's do the next one. Nirashirya tachittatma vyakta sarva parigraha shariram kevalam karma kurvajnana noti kimbasham.
Without hope, desire, with the mind self-controlled, having abandoned all sense of possessions, doing mere bodily actions, he incurs no sin.
So we're still continuing to talk about the person of knowledge, like the sage, the saint, the Buddha, and here we're saying, how do they act? So their mind has completely been destroyed by the fire of knowledge. So the mind here being the limited ego faculty, where they're constantly thinking about analyzing every situation and saying, how is this going to affect me? Am I going to be okay? Am I not going to be okay? All of those ideas, that's gone. So without hope here is, when we talk about hope, it's always about the future. It's never in the now. It's like it's always living in a dream world where we are imagining that if I do something, or rather, this situation that is right now is not okay, and I want it to be slightly different, and I'm imagining that if it was like this, it would be so wonderful, right? So there's this hope, and for this person of knowledge, that's gone because there's no sort of like place where they are not feeling content. Like there's no place where they're not, because they're always have access to that place. Then with the mind self-controlled, and here we're talking about, so here, what's the word for self-controlled? Yes, chitta atma. So chitta is essentially like the thoughts that, or I would say the consciousness that we like the mind kind of has, where we are thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future, or any impression comes in, we start imagining a bunch of things. Like when you're walking on the street, you look at like a person wearing a particular shirt, you may remember that this other person had this shirt, or like how our sort of mind has like a drop falls into the water, and then like there's ripples that get created. So our mind is also like that, where like a small impression that just comes in and we start imagining a bunch of things, right? Like if somebody is talking about like a trip that they did, we will start imagining about a trip that we did, because of like these sort of impressions that create more and more stories and thoughts in our minds. So for this person, they have control their mind. So like they are consciously always choosing to think or not think. It's not like unconsciously things are happening because of the work that they've done, and the mind is now brought under control. And having abandoned all sense of possessions. So here we're talking about our possessions are like, if for the normal folks and for people like us, like our possessions tend to bind us in many ways. When the more stuff we have, the more miserable we end up feeling, because now it's all about protecting those possessions, right? Like they say that, a person who's very wealthy has a lot of fear, because now the fear is not about whether they're going to be okay, but it's going to be more about whether they're going to lose all the stuff that they have. So it's interesting, right? Like no amount of money can kind of like solve that problem for you, because the root of it is not the bank balance, or it's not the lack of something. It's just this belief that I'm not going to be okay, no matter the external situation. So for this person, they've abandoned that. Like even though they may be very wealthy, but internally they know that they really own nothing. It's all, everything is on loan. Like it's, which is true. You know, all the stuff that we have is on loan, including the life that we lead, including the relationships that we have. All of them are on loan. It's only a matter of time before they, either we die or somebody else will die. Right? Like that's the way that everything is going to end for our own personal experience. So recognizing that, this person has abandoned all possessions, because how can I say I own this? You know, it's just on loan. Like even though I have paid for it and I own it, and I seem to think that I own a bunch of stuff, but I own nothing really. And this has become like it's a consequence of realizing that, you know, our true essential nature. Once we get a taste of that, all of these like silly ideas of like, I have this much money, I own this much things, and all of that, all of those kind of drop away. And then because their mind is kind of empty, right? Their mind is not thinking about the future, it's not thinking about the past, it's kind of empty. Moment to moment, it's empty. So because of which they are very efficient. So they just like, you know, doing actions that are necessary in front of them. They can use their mind, they can solve a problem. And then once the problem is solved, they put the mind back into the pocket and they continue to, you know, hang out and chill out. And because of that, they incur no sin. And sin is, I don't like the word sin, but essentially incur no additional baggage or no additional karma. Because all of those, you know, the karma that we accumulate is because of this egoistic sense of like, am I going to be okay? Is this action good for me? Should I invest my energy in learning this new skill? Because if I do this, then I will get this promotion in this, in the work that I'm doing. All of those weird ideas that we have, because it's always bent on this future goal or this future outcome. And no, there's nothing wrong in saying that it's not worth pursuing those things, but just understanding that that's what we're doing. We're creating more and more baggage. But for the person of knowledge, whatever action they do, they incur no additional karma or bondage. So that's the implication of this verse, and this is where we want to get to. So we always want to like have this ideal. Like this is, wow, this person, imagine if I could be from that place, you know. So like understanding that that's where we can get to if we do this work. And it may not be attractive, or it may be attractive, but know that, you know, this is a possibility for all of us. Any thoughts about this? Okay, let's do one more. Yacchitta labha santushto dvanda tito vimatsaraha samaha siddhavasiddhau cha kritvapi na nibhandaye.
Content with what comes to him without effort, free from the pairs of opposites and envy, even-minded in success and failure, though acting he is not bound.
Cool. So now it's like, you know, we described a little bit of the physical aspect of things, but now we're talking about like when they're doing action, how do they feel? So so usually when we are thinking about you know, our lives, what we are, you know, getting, you know, let's say we are like really striving for the promotion, sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't get it, and we are like, why did I not get it? I deserved it, I did so much work, this other person was useless. All these thoughts that we have, we are constantly evaluating it and like, you know, looking at it from this sort of contracted viewpoint. which is like, I did so much effort, right? Like this limited sense of identity. And to this person, they are just happy with whatever comes and whatever goes, because they know for a fact that everything is on loan and everything happens not just from my limited sense of effort. We always tend to think that everything that we get in life is because of my effort. I did it, I deserve it, not realizing that a lot of other things influence what's happening to me moment to moment. The air that we're breathing is not because of just me. It's like all these trees and all these other forces of nature have to exist for the air to be the way it is, right? So there's this connection, and there's all this intricacies in this entire universe that is making this thing possible, our experience of life. So that's like a naturally occurring thought for this person. So because that person has understood this, they're content with whatever comes, whatever goes, knowing that everything is going to be okay, because their sense of existential crisis and all of that is gone. And then freeing from the pairs of opposites. So pairs of opposites is an interesting phrase in yoga, which is essentially describing the entire physical universe. The opposites, so something like hot and cold, rich and poor, intelligent and stupid. All of those are essentially the boundaries of physicality. And within those boundaries, there are the spectrum of things, right? So heat, for example, there's extreme hot and extreme cold. And within this extremities, there are all the, experiences of heat. So for example, like we may think, oh, I am so smart right now. And then in a moment later, you're like, I'm so stupid, right? Like this sort of extremities and these opposites are always binding us. Because in one moment we may feel very good, in the other moment we may feel really shitty. Not realizing that you cannot feel good without feeling shitty, right? They're both two sides of the same coin. In order to feel sad, there has to be a feeling of happiness, right? So we are always bound by that. But the person of knowledge has sort of gone beyond it, because all of the pairs of opposites are essentially qualities of the physical. So qualities of the body, qualities of the mind. And if we can go beyond it, we have been free from it. So like even-minded in success and failure, that's like, pretty probably easy to understand, which is like, because they are sort of past the physicalities, they don't really get bothered by the fact that something has succeeded or failed, like how we do, where we get extremely elated when something works out or extremely sad when something fails. They have no such like extreme emotion like that. Though acting, they're not bound. So, like the previous verse, even though they're doing a lot of physical actions and working, they're not bound by the actions, because they don't have this limited sense of identity that's the motivation of the work that they're doing. Cool. So any thoughts about this? Okay, so I think this is the last verse, which talks about the okay, so maybe there's maybe one more verse. So maybe this is a good place to stop for this class, and we can continue down this in the next class. So so we covered a bunch of interesting thoughts and concepts this class. Anybody has any questions of what we did so far? Any thoughts they would like to share? Excuse me. If not, we can do a meditation. Okay, so let's do a meditation. Oh, so for this class, I'm gonna, a couple of my friends gifted me this gong, so I can use it for the beginning of the meditation. It'd be nice. All right, so everybody sit in a comfortable position. If you're not sitting up straight, I would recommend you to sit up straight so that your back is upright. And then you're going to start the meditation with this gong. So start by taking a few deep breaths, just consciously, longer than usual. And just notice if there's any part of the body which is feeling tense. And if it is, just breathe into that part of the body. And imagine that on the exhale, that tension is getting released. Let's take a few more deep breaths. And then on the exhale, just relax and settle into the body. So the breath is a very immediate way for our minds to come back into the present moment. We just like focusing on the incoming breath and the outgoing breath immediately brings our attention from whatever thoughts that we were maybe focusing on, immediately brings us back into the now, because the body is always in the now. Body has no ability to think about stuff. So putting our attention to the body brings it back into the now. So keep using this breath as a way to remind us that now is the only place where the reality is. Our thoughts and imaginations are all in the dream world. We want to stop living in that world and kind of reprogram ourselves to be in the now, be in the now. We focus on the breath. And it's important to be aware of every part of the breath. So you're inhaling and then you're exhaling, but there's a gap between the inhale and the exhale. Make sure that there's a gap. And the gap is important because in the gap, there is a door, a doorway to our true being. You want to pay attention to when the breath ends. And then there's this gap. Pay attention to the gap. And then pay attention to when the next breath begins. And in the gap, try to see if you can notice who is it or what is it that is even aware. You may get a sense of just emptiness in the gap, where there's nothing, there's no feeling, There's no thought in the gap. Feels like an empty sky. Or not. If that's not your experience, that's fine too. But just start to pay attention to the nothingness of the gap between the breaths, the incoming and the outgoing breath. And in that nothingness, you may notice sensations and activity. And that's fine. But you want to keep paying attention to the background in which this gap exists. If your mind is bringing up thoughts, it's fine. Acknowledge that thoughts are happening and bring your attention back to the breath. Just the act of acknowledging a thought occurring gives us some space to get out of our theme of thinking. Keep bringing the attention back and paying attention to the gaps between the breaths. Slowly bring your attention back to objective reality. When you're ready, you may open your eyes. So like always, we will end our class with the ending chant. So sound, if you can share the screen, please. Awesome, thank you. So you can join me or you can just listen as well. Yogarato va, hogarato va, yogarato va, hogarato va, sangarato va, sangavihina, sangarato va, Sangavihina Yasya Brahmani Ramate Chitta Yasya Brahmani Ramate Chitta Nandati Nandati Nandatyeva Nandati Nandati Nandatyeva Nandati Nandati Nandatyeva. So this verse kind of explains the entirety of the goal and the purpose of this work, to seek enjoyment and revel in the self. Because if we can learn to do that, we can be blissed out no matter where we are and no matter in any situation. Because that should be the basis from which we should act when we are blissful. Because if we are from a place of poverty, mental poverty, all our actions are going to be less than what they should be. So I hope that this is a possibility for us all. One thing I did want to add as well was, a discussion that came up with a couple of folks last week. It was about anger and how anger can be, used positively to do things, which I think is true. It's just that I guess the way we want to describe it in language is that anger is essentially an emotion, or rather a response to energy, right? So like when we are in a situation that maybe calls to us in a way that, releases a lot of energy because we are interested or we are surprised or we are agitated, it's just essentially energy coming up in the body. And what we do with the energy is of critical importance, which is we can use it and shout at somebody else and release that energy from that in that way. We can hit somebody, we can violently insult somebody, and those are responses in which this energy is released. But that is unfortunately an unconscious way of responding to energy. So what we want to start to do is, how do we start to work with this energy in our body and use it in a constructive way that solves the problem which is in front of us. So a lot of the work that we're doing is, starting to get conscious about our moment-to-moment experience. So even in situations where we are angry and upset, essentially what's happening is just a ton of energy is being released. And our habitual tendency tends to be to, respond unconsciously, or, if it's in the case of anger, it could be like yelling at somebody or yelling at our own self, whatever it is, right? So we want to start to get conscious that that's what's going on. And then once we get conscious, we can change. And we can use it to actually solve the issue that's actually bothering us. So that's all. I wanted to just add that as well. But that's the end of the class. Like always, I'm happy to hang out and talk to folks and answer any questions. But thank you for the wonderful class, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Puneet.
Thank you.